So when we read the Bible, we read it from our perspective, from where we stand. And that was written, it's one of the very first books of the Bible, New Testament, ever written. It was written maybe 10 to 25 years after Christ was crucified, which is very early, because the Gospel of John was probably written maybe 60 years after Christ was crucified. So that's a long period of time. But James is one of the very first books. It's before we have all the creeds. It's before we have a lot of the things that are shaping us. Before even the Gospels were written, James was written. And now James is the brother of Jesus, or he's the brother of John. One of those guys there. We're not really sure who wrote it. Kind of sure, but we're not really sure. But when we read it, we are 2,000 years away from that point. We're across the ocean in a different culture. And so the things that shape how we read the Bible, often we don't really see them because it's just the water that we're swimming in. And so here's a couple of things that didn't exist when this book was written. The Declaration of Independence. That was, 200 and some years ago. We wrote this Declaration of Independence. We became a country. That has really shaped the world. How we do our government and our elections and democracy and all this stuff. Something that didn't exist then, individual rights. Like, you know how much that has shaped how we see the world today? It's like we have this Bill of Rights. And that Bill of Rights tells us what our rights are as citizens. And probably about 90% of the people living in this world that had James, they didn't have that. They didn't have any rights. Nothing. So that's shaped us. A justice system. We have, courts and all that. They had courts as well, but only citizens of the Roman Empire were allowed to go to court. If you were not a Roman citizen, they would probably just throw you in jail or crucify you. That's about it. But you didn't have rights, and there was no promise to a fair trial or anything like that. And also free market capitalism. How we run our economy today, that didn't exist then. Like most of the people are just farmers, and most of the people are poor. So all of these things shape how we read these scriptures when we're talking about rich versus poor. Right? And we see this, if you're a rich person and you walk into the church and you get special attention, then there's something wrong with this kind of thing. But we're reading that from where we are today with all of these things that has shaped how, and I'm sure we're going to have different interpretations of all this stuff, but these are the things that have shaped our minds that didn't exist back then. So we got to kind of step back and say, okay, what did it mean to these people? And get into their mindset, see their world from their perspective, and then come back to where we are and pull the principles forward. That's how I try to read the Bible, is I jump into the perspectives where they were, try to see the world as they saw it, and then fast forward here. So this one starts off where he says, hey, my brothers and sisters, who's he writing to? James is the leader of the church in Jerusalem, and he's sending letters all over the place because he's trying to keep everyone organized. There's all these other churches around, and he's specifically writing to Jewish Christians who they believe that, the word Christian probably didn't even exist at this point, but Jewish followers of Jesus who believed he was the Messiah. And they're dispersed all over the known world. And so he's sending letters out to all these small churches all over the place and trying to give them direction and instruction, because this is brand new. They don't know how to do this Christianity thing. They don't even have a creed that says, okay, this is the thing that we all have to agree to and believe to. That didn't exist. The creed that held everyone together was written a couple centuries later, after the Roman government kind of co-opted the Christianity and brought it into the thing, and there's a lot of history around that. That didn't exist. So these early Christians, just maybe a decade or a decade and a half after the crucifixion of Christ, the thing that binds them together is, how are we going to live together and follow this person that Jesus was? How are we going to live out who Jesus was here in our small little communities? And they are under a Roman government. And so James is giving them instruction. Now, some theologians hate the book of James. Did you know this? The great reformer, Martin Luther, who took the 95 Theses and nailed it on the wall in Wittenberg and started the whole Protestant Reformation, That guy, he actually said about the book of James, he's like, I wish I could just like throw that in the trash. He called it the epistle of straw, which is basically like it's light, it's fluffy, it doesn't do anything. He hated this one. He hated it because it's filled with like, here's what you have to do. And he was more of like, your faith saves you kind of a person. And he couldn't reconcile that faith versus here are the things you have to do kind of an understanding. He called it faith versus works. And that was back in the 1600s, y'all. So he didn't like this book very much. Now, some people will say this book here is actually just commentary on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Because a lot of the teachings of the Sermon on the Mount are in there. And that was the thing that bound Christians together, is how do we live out Jesus' teachings? The Sermon on the Mount is, if you want to be my follower, then here are the things that we do. And so they're trying in this early stage, without a creed that binds them together, is like, this is the code of conduct that we live by. And that was the thing that kind of was the glue that held everyone together. And so when we read this, it can sound really harsh. It can sound really judgmental. It can sound like it's a weapon. Like someone's just taking it and is like, hey, if you don't have works, your faith is dead and that's not going to save you. And it's like, oh my God, like what is he even talking about? But if we inhabit the world that it was, see it from their perspective, it's like, okay, I think we can understand some things here. And it says, here's what you don't want to do. When somebody with gold rings and fancy clothes walks into your church, well, it was actually a synagogue because they were Jewish, walks into there, you don't want to pay them special attention. And then somebody who comes in with like rags and like they're not doing so well, you don't want to like, yeah, you go stand in the back. That's what you don't want to do. Now, I started to think to myself, this is not, I mean, like 90% of the entire human race at this point in history, they were like in poverty. They lived hand to mouth. Like they had to grow their food and eat it. And how are they like, if 90% of the people are impoverished, who are the other 10%? That's what I wanted to know. Like, who's the person who has a gold ring that's going to walk into your church? And I actually found out that there was a Roman law that said only specific people were allowed to wear gold rings. They had a specific purpose. You know who they were? The Roman politicians. Believe it or not, this is who it was. So if a Roman politician, they were called Epicureans, like a really upstanding elite member of politicians, like walks into your church and you're like enamored, like, oh my gosh, so-and-so's here. And they're like, you know what they can do for us? You know what's going to happen? Like, if we can get on their good side, they're going to be able to do this and this and this and this and this. And then a poor person walks in, which is going to be 90% of everybody else in the world. And they're kind of like, they don't have all that great clothes on. They're dirty because they've been farming all day because that was their job. And they walk in and you're like, yeah, go stand in the back. Excuse me, sir, with the gold rings, who's a Roman politician in our area. Come down to the front and sit here. What James is saying here, my brothers and this is my retranslation, the TRV, Tom Rundell version. My brothers and sisters, don't mix the faith of our gracious Lord Jesus Christ with social opinions of somebody's class. Don't let a man with great power and authority shape your opinion of your fellow humans. If a politician and a destitute beggar come into your synagogue and you usher one to the front and send the other back to stand, have you not usurped Christ's authority and become a judge with oppressive opinions? That's what he's saying. Like, don't allow the people with all of the money and the power and the influence and the authority to shape who it is that you ought to be hating. That's what he's saying. Okay, that has a little bit of application for us today, right? Like, who gets to define your social opinions of of other people? Like, who is it that defines your opinion of those people? And by those people, I mean the people who are not like you. Because we all have a those people, right? Because we have, this is me, and this is who I am, and then I like the people who are like me, and they think like me, and act like me, and all. That's natural human condition. But then everyone who's not that becomes a those people. Everyone has a those people. Who gets to shape your opinion of those people? And that's what this is talking about. There's a lot of, and he's saying, don't let somebody with a lot of bling walk into your church and tell you with all their power and authority who it is that you ought to be hating. That's what James is telling these people. The people with all of the riches and the power and the authority, which is a different group today. It's going to be a lot of different groups. But you know what he's saying? The church is supposed to be a place where all are welcome, and nobody is a better person than another person because of who they are on the outside of the walls of the church. That's what James is saying. And guess what? When a slave walked in, because they had slavery during this time, it wasn't abolished until the Emancipation Proclamation of Lincoln. Like when our church was forming, it was abolished back then. Like slavery was common practice. Most of the people back then are going to be slaves or like bottom class society. When they walked into a church, they were not considered a slave. That didn't happen anywhere else in the world. And if a political Epicurean with all the authority walked into a church, they were not considered somebody who had a lot of power in the church. Like, you're welcome to come with us. And guess what? You get to serve communion to the slave today. And it's like, the slave is probably thinking to himself like, whoa, I can't believe like this person with all these riches and power and authority is going to serve me. I'm a slave. I serve everybody else. That's my job. That's my place in society. When you walked into a church, that didn't exist. That did not exist. And that is something right off the bat that James is trying to nail down. Like, there is no class of people better than other people. When they walk into your church, they are a human being loved by God. And that's just it. There are no those people in these doors. He says, and make sure that you're doing that. I like what Dorothy Day, she was one of my favorite thinkers from the early 1900s. That sounds weird to say, but I graduated college in the late 1900s. But here it is. The gospel takes away our right forever to discriminate between the deserving and the undeserving poor. Whoa. That's what the early church really believed when people walked in the door. It's like, you are a human and we love you. And if a person that walks in the door and they are like a big fancy big wig in society, they have money and power and authority and whatever, and they walk in and you're like, let me show you where to sit, sir. And you like bring them to a seat like this. And then somebody, who's more destitute and down and out, and you're like, actually we got a place for you. You stand in the back, just kind of stay out of the way and stay quiet. That you just go back there. And what James is saying is then you become the judge at that point. You all remember Judge Judy? I remember staying home sick from school to watch Judge Judy. And she laid down the law. But we become the Judge Judy in that moment. And we're just like, you know what? This person must be a great person because they have riches and power and authority. And that person must not be a good person because they don't. And all of a sudden, we have taken over Christ's role. Christ is the judge of all humanity, and he judges with the most mercy and love available. That's why we are not fit to be the judge of humans, because our opinions of those people are swayed so easily by things we hear. Whether you hear it on a podcast or on social media or on your news channels or wherever you are, those things shape your opinions of other people. And those things sway back and forth really fast and really easy, which is why we're not qualified to be the judge of other people, because we're so influenced by so many different forces. Christ is the one who's like determined to judge all of humanity. Now, that phrase there is fun because we can get into John where he says, I judge no one. But there's the thing, like, we can't take away the authority of Christ and say, you know what, I'm going to judge today. You're great, you're not, you're in, you're out, you're excluded, you're included. No. When you walk in the doors of this church, you are on equal level playing field as every single other person. Whether it's your first time or you've been coming here since Norma, like in the early 50s, like, doesn't matter. You walk in this church and you are on level, equal playing field as everybody else. That's how it goes. One of my favorite theologians, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, he said this: judging others makes us blind, whereby love is illuminating. By judging others, we blind ourselves to our own evil and to the grace which others are just as entitled to as we are. That's a beautiful, beautiful phrase. And that there, we are not the judge of those people. We are the people who love those people. All of the peoples we are supposed to love. And then he goes on to say this. He says, listen up, beloved ones. Didn't God choose the destitutes of the world to be wealthy in faith and full citizens in the kingdom promised to those who love him? And then you insult them like this? Like, remind me, who is it that brings their authority down upon you oppressively by dragging you into debtor's court and robbing you blind? They put a stain upon the name Christian. Now, courts in this day and age were not courts like we have. If you owed somebody money, they didn't have a bankruptcy law that you can go and file for bankruptcy and like start over again. If you owed somebody money, you owed somebody rich, basically, because those are the people who had the money to lend. And if you owed them money and you couldn't pay it back, they would drag you into court. They would send you into debtor's prison. And it was kind of like this. You ever play that game? Monopoly? You get that, like, do not pass go. Like, you go to jail. Do not collect your $200. That's how court systems worked back in the day. Like, you owed somebody money, they would put you in prison until you or your family got the money to get you out. That's just how it worked. That's what prisons were for. Because they didn't bother to imprison a thief. They would just, like, execute them. They didn't bother to imprison, like, all the different crimes that we can think of that you go to prison for, they didn't care about. They would just execute those people. But if you owed someone money, then there was value to your life still, and they would throw you into debtor's prison. And who are the people who have all of this authority to do so? The people with the bling, the gold rings. They walked in, they're like, you know what? That guy owes me money. And all of a sudden, you are like paying all this special favor to the person who's going to drag you into court later on. And James is saying, don't do it. Don't do it at all. One of my favorite theologians, James Cone, he says, the poor are God's chosen people, not because they are righteous or humble, but because God has chosen them as objects of his special care and concern. Because God is drawn to people who are in suffering. God is a compassionate being drawn to those people. And poverty is a thing that makes humanity suffer. So when God says God favors the poor, it's not because they're like holier than everybody else, but because they're suffering. And God is drawn to those who suffer. So that's what he says. And then he says, you do better just to follow the golden rule. Love others as you love yourself. But if you pay special attention to the powerful, you go against this rule and stand convicted by it. So speak and act as if this is the one law our judge is going to use. Because mercy wins over judgment every time. That's how it goes. And that golden rule, treat others as you would wish to be treated. Did you know that Jesus did not coin that? He was quoting somebody else. Did you know that? I didn't know that. It was actually Rabbi Hillel. He took that phrase and turned it into a positive. But Rabbi Hillel, the elder, said, do not unto others that which is hateful unto thee. And Jesus took out the not and says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. He like put a twist on Hillel, the elder, back in his day. And he says, that's what Christians to be about. Love other people the way you wish to be loved. Treat other people the way you wish to be. Don't do to somebody else what you would not want done to you. It says, if that's the one rule that y'all can follow, then you're good. That's what James said. Like, that's the thing that should bind you all together, is that you're loving other people the way you wish to see love in this world. Because love matters more. And then he goes into this part that says, religious facts, those who claim I have the truth, religious facts without loving action does not equal rescue for this world. And here's my translation. What's the use, my brothers and sisters, if someone says I have the truth, but they don't have the love to back it up? Can mere religious words rescue them? If a brother or sister lacks the basic needs like food and clothing, and you piously say to them, go in peace, warm yourself and feed yourself, and you withhold the basic necessities, what's the point? So religious conviction all by itself, without compassionate actions alongside of it, is a lifeless corpse. Dang, James. Yeah, some good stuff. There is no such thing as pulling yourself up by bootstraps. Because that's what happens when you pull bootstraps up. Like, there is no such thing as that. People can't do it at all. Desmond Tutu says this, God's dream is that you and I and all of us will realize that we are family. That we are made for togetherness, for goodness, and for compassion. That is what James is trying to get at. Not trying to throw judgments upon people who are not in the religious realm. He's trying to get people to stop being self-righteous with their religion and use it as a weapon upon other people. and then to try and cozy up to people with the power and authority to try and garner their support, to get on their side, and then use all of that against other people. He's like, don't do that. Just love other people the way you want to be loved. Treat other people the way you want to be treated. That's the golden rule. That's the rule that Christ has as his, that's his motto right there. It was golden rule for a reason. That's the gold standard that Jesus says, this is the one thing that we shall be judged by, is how we treat other people. It's plain and simple, and James is trying to spell that out for us through the entire book. Here's what it looks like in your community to love other people as you want to be loved and as you want to be treated. So a couple of reflection questions for us. Who has shaped my opinion of those I have a hard time loving? Because somebody shaped it. Somebody has shaped you to have an opinion towards those people. We all have that. So who has done that? Is love the most important law that I adhere to? That's a good question. Do I seek to be understood or to understand? Thank you, St. Francis of Assisi, for that reflection question. Do I like ideas about God more than the people that God loves? Oh, good Lord have mercy. That is a church problem today, if you've ever seen one. Do I love ideas about God more than the people that God loves? So those are some questions for us to reflect on this week as we kind of chew on James' material. And I have our benediction here, Psalm 146. I have been found. I kneel down and look up with all the fallen whom your hand upholds. Morning by morning you renew my hope, that as you draw me from the gentle folds of sleep, you'll draw me from the snares of death. I'll live to praise the one whose love upholds the universe from end to end. Each breath is praise, and when at last my soul goes forth on my last breath, you'll bring me up from death and into life with you, as on this earth you loose us from our prisons and defend the stranger and the fatherless. In death you feed the hungry, and in darkness send your light to heal our blindness. Even so we'll know you as our King, world without end. Psalm 146 by Malcolm Guy.